I wanted to get a little bit more into your personal history on this subject. Now, you're a very popular guy for lots of different reasons. People know you. They know you as a voice of reason in the black community. They know you for your relationship ribs. They know you from relentlessly mocking Georgia and FSU on Twitter, which is something that I personally find highly entertaining. But what they may not know about are your personal experiences with racism, and that extends from the explicit forms of racism that we all know about to some casual forms of racism that maybe we aren't as familiar with. Obviously, this is not my story to tell, so I'd love for you to be able to tell our listeners a little bit more about all that.
So as you look at it, I've always been I've always been a target, right? Throughout my entire life, even as I was growing up. I mean, I've always been a pretty big guy. You could tell I probably played some sort of sport, whether it be basketball, whether it be football, or whatever it may have been. So I was always a target. As I walk into, when I lived in the suburbs, if I walked into a pool hall, which was probably predominantly white, I get looks. And I don't know if it was so many looks that they were like, "Hey, hopefully this guy plays football," or I think he's famous. And I think that was more the underhanded racism that I saw a lot. Is that somebody said you have to, for you to be here, you have to play a sport. And that as a big black guy or as a big guy that's walking in like that, it's one of those things where it's just like, at the time it doesn't seem frustrating, but do you walk in those doors and that same reaction happens? Let's say you don't. Let's say I had a bunch of gold teeth in my mouth, and I got chains hanging from my neck, and whatever may happen. Do I get treated the same, or do those looks still happen? I'm going to say yes, because they're not thinking so much, or people know who I am. It's like not so much am I an athlete anymore. It's like, hey man, what's this guy here? What's he up to? I lived in Tampa. Tampa's a pretty metropolitan area, and even in my younger day, I saw it up close, and it wasn't so. It was with an officer. I got pulled over, and you know, I was my girlfriend drove a Mustang. She drove a really nice Mustang. She was white, and she was driving. We were coming down. My neighborhood was in Tampa. Anybody knows New Tampa? Bruce B. Downs over in New Tampa, Tampa Palms area, right where Vernon Hargraves actually. Morton High School's out that way. So that area was just starting to be developed. Some of the new housing, but my mom has a really good job, and she did really good for herself. So as I was living with her, I remember we were coming down Bruce B. Downs Boulevard, and we get pulled over. And this is probably the first time that's happened, but we get pulled over. I didn't think we were doing anything wrong, but obviously there's 3 or 4 police cruisers that pull up. And I remember the cop leaning into the window or asking for her license and registration. She's like, "Hey, what did I do?" And he said, "No, we're just doing random checks." And I said, at that point, I was sitting in the passenger seat, so I just shrugged it off. I was looking out the window, and he asked her, he's like, "Ma'am, are you okay?" And she's like, "Yeah, I'm fine." And they shine the light on me and said, "Ma'am, are you sure you're okay?" I mean, that was,
Oh,
you look at it. I don't know how blatant that can get. Um,
that's
that was tough. That was surely a tough one, and it was by. Here's the bad news: is that it was by a Hillsborough County sheriff. My uncle worked for him, so it's just at that point in time. I hate to say I blew it off, but it always stuck with me. I didn't completely fall off my shoulders. It didn't. I didn't forget about it. Because it happened years later, which we'll come to in a second. But you look back at it, and it's just like you watch TV and you watch these programs and you watch this stuff go on TVs. And I never personally experienced it, beyond that point, because at that point I was 15 or 16 years old, 16 years old. So I never experienced it. When it first happens, it enrages you. It makes you really angry. It's like, wow, I'm a guy that I didn't do anything. I've never been in trouble with the law. I've had maybe a few tickets in my entire life. Even at that point, I had zero. My mom was she owned her own business. She lived. I mean, we lived in a pretty nice house. I drove a nice, okay car. I drove a decent car. But for me, it's like, why did I get profiled? I remember back to like a episode of the Fresh Prince of Bel Air. It's actually one of the first times I saw racism up close and personal. You probably know what I'm talking about. It's when Carlton got pulled over, and Will was trying to tell him, it's because you're a black guy driving while black. And that whole thing was based off of that episode was based off of racism. It hit home, but it was just an episode, and to me, it didn't make a lot of sense until that happened to me. Fast forward years later, when I was coming out of I was coming out of Gainesville, I got pulled over. I was in my mom's BMW. So like I said, my mom drives a really nice car. She's done well for herself. So I was driving it. I was actually still in. I was just fresh out of college. I was coming to visit my girlfriend, and I get pulled over again. And they pulled me over the side of the road. And first of all, I'm thinking I couldn't have done anything wrong unless there was something wrong with the car, like the tail lights out. But I came to a stop sign. I know exactly what I did. I didn't even do a California stop where you roll right through the stop sign. I was like, there's nothing I could have did. And normally, if I would have gotten pulled over, I would have been like, hey, I know I was speeding. Hey, I know I ran a red light or whatever. I was always very cooperative with the police. Maybe why I didn't have any problems. But on this certain time, as I pulled up, and it was a black BMW. There was not a lot of tint on the windows, so I could see even if they were going after the tint. So as the guy comes up, he basically shines. Well, no, he asked me, he's like, license and registration. I said, what am I being pulled over for? He said, we're just doing some random checks. And I think that's always been that their go-to statement when you're kind of getting that look or whatever. So I said, well, what do you mean you're doing random checks? That doesn't make sense to me. And so he totally ignores that statement and says, well, is this your car? I said, well, it's my mom's car. I was like, if you notice, I was like, can I grab the registration? He was like, yeah, just do it slowly. I'm like, okay. So I grabbed the registration. I said, if you can see it, this is my mom's car. I'm from Tampa. I'm here visiting my girlfriend. Well, I don't know. So all of a sudden, there's like four other cruisers that roll up. Four, like in the middle of a traffic stop, four cruisers roll up, and I see them coming up. And the thing, one guy, you can see the officer coming up on the passenger side, hand on his gun. So I said, look, I need to go. Like, I want to get back to Tampa because I was literally leaving to go back to Tampa. And he said, well, do you mind if I search your car? And I said, what do you need to search my car for? I was like, I don't have any, like, no. I was like, if I tell you no, what are you going to do? He's like, well, you're going to have to sit here for the next 45 minutes. And we're going to have to bring the canines out, and he's going to have to snip the outside of your car and so it's just better if you cooperate with us right now. So, so looking back at that, so I had to let him search my car, which I didn't mind. I didn't care. But as I sit there, I remember getting back in my car and crying. I was 22 at that point. I was 22 years old and I was crying. And I was 23 and I was crying like a baby. I remember driving back and calling my mom on the phone, and I didn't even get her involved because I didn't want it to be any incident. I knew I didn't have anything. To worry about when they were searching my car. But I remember driving back to Tampa, just tears in my eyes. And I don't cry a lot. Like, it takes a little bit for me to cry. And it brought back up the time that I was pulled back over in Tampa and how rampant racism is. And we're talking about over the course of, like, going through a college career, not having to deal with that, playing football, not having to deal with that whatsoever, because as an athlete, I didn't have to deal with that. Maybe not straight up in my face, but I didn't have to deal with that. But then, just like a normal guy on the street, just driving down in a nice car, nice neighborhood, I get pulled over, and I just cried, man. I was just like, and it really made me realize how bad we had things as a nation, or how bad what kind of shape we were in. And the tough thing to deal with that was because I was raised in the suburbs, and I was raised on the rough side of town. I was one of those guys that went in the middle. I just wanted everybody to love everybody. And unfortunately, I just, that kind of was a slap in the face that it's just never going to be like that. I don't know if it is. I don't know what it's going to take. But it was not like that. So as I cried and as I went back to Tampa, there was some really good people in my life, both black and white, that forced me to have that conversation of not every person's bad, not every cop is bad, not every situation you'll run into is a racial situation. But at the end of the day, you can't forget about it. And you got to think about today's climate, right? Today's climate is that there's been a lot of people that have been racially profiled in one way or another. Black people, even white people. There's been people that have been racially profiled by police officers, by a guy standing at, a jewelry counter. And it happened to me when I was in a spot. I was actually in the league. I walked up to the counter. I was going to buy a really nice watch. And my wife told me that I didn't see it at the time, but the guy pointed, like the security guard pointed that person to the front door to go stand by the front door as I was holding the watch, just looking at it, so I didn't run out. So, it's stuff like that happens, and I'm glad I didn't see that. She was upset about it. I'm glad I don't see stuff like that, but it is rampant. And, right now it's just, you think about every person that's had something racial happen to them. Breonna Taylor was another thing that was so live and in your face. And then George Floyd, that was a straw that broke the camel's back. It's not so much that it happened to them. No, an officer didn't have a knee in the back of their family member, or didn't have a knee in the back of them personally. But you think about every racial incident. Let's not just talk about with cops. You talk about with everybody. You profile for some odd reason, and in this case, it was extreme that it involved the death. But then you think about every situation that had. It's really tough. It's really tough for somebody not to get upset at that, or to think, man, this is
Sure.
this is this is my America. For me, I'm a little bit more heady. I'm a little bit more forgiving. I'm a little bit more. It hasn't directly happened to me. I know it'd probably be different if it did, but there's got to be some stuff that change. That it has to change. If it does not change, we're done.
I'll,
We're done. And that kind of goes without saying, we're done.
Yeah.
I'll tell you as a sorry, I got a little emotional hearing that. As a Southern white man, there's nothing I'm going to be able to say that's going to make that better. But hearing and listening and valuing those stories and those voices, and that to me is just something that when people say, well, I haven't done anything wrong in this country, it really took, people like Breonna Taylor, people like George Floyd. And it was 3 years ago today that Philandro Castle was shot in
Yep.
his car.
Yeah.
So it really takes things like that no, I haven't done anything wrong personally in my life, but it's now the jobs of people like Neil and myself and white people that necessarily hasn't happened to us to lend the voice to someone like you where it has happened. And you're an elevated voice to begin with because you're Gator great, firstly,
Yeah.
but you're a great person that is. When Neil and I were talking, I'm like, we need to get Shannon on because Shannon's an ambassador not only of the Gator program, but of the community, of his own community, with recruits, with Sunny's Barbecue, with the things that we'll get into a little later on in the show. I challenge any listener that just listened to that. This has a place in sports. This dialogue needs to have a place in sports because you can't root on the Florida Gators and not root on success of African American student athletes.
I just wanted to make a quick point for the record. Um, for those of you who don't know, maybe you're a new listener or a new viewer, new follower. I'm the guy that's behind those social media accounts that you've probably interacted with. I'm the guy that writes most of the articles on allkindsofweather.com. I'm the guy who puts together those videos on YouTube that you've probably seen. It's my job to put together words and tell stories. And right now I don't have any words. Shannon just left me speechless. There's nothing I can think of to say at this point. I mean, again, it's my job to have words for things, and I don't have any, and that's not something that happens very often. So that's just a testament to just how compelling and how powerful and how moving Shannon's story is right there.